Long before forks gleamed on our dinner tables or microwaves warmed our leftovers with magnetic wizardry, meals were events. Not casual, reheated leftovers in a Tupperware events. Oh no. We're talking medieval feasts that were equal parts nourishment, ceremony, and elbows on the table mayhem. Let's start somewhere soft. Bread. You've had it, I hope. You may have even buttered it dramatically, like a squire trying to impress someone named Mildred. But in the Middle Ages, bread wasn't just breakfast. It was the plate. Specifically, a trencher, a thick, stale hunk of bread used to hold whatever mixture of meats, stews, or regrettable fish paste lay atop it. Imagine dining with no need for dishwashing. Just hand your saturated loaf to a servant, a dog, or a very lucky beggar. Environmental, edible, and vaguely unsanitary. The sustainable tableware of yore. Sandwiches, merely trencher innovation with a marketing team. Of course, what graced the top of those, trenchers varied wildly depending on who you were. If you were noble, born into more land than you could alphabetize, your platter might see roasted peacock with all its feathers stuck back on. A decorative decision that screamed, yes, I killed this thing, and yes, it looks fabulous. The peasants? Oh, they got porridge, barley, oats, any grain willing to mush under heat and low expectations. The word pottage drifted through their homes like a thin fog of hope. It was a bubbling cauldron of whatever might still be considered food, onions, turnips, dreams, a never-ending stew to which they added more as they ate. Culinary maintenance rather than a recipe. And yet, this humble porridge was a marvel of medieval resourcefulness. It asked for little, gave back as much as it could, and burned your tongue every single time. If you're lying back, listening with eyes half closed, wondering, did peasants really eat from trenchers too? Oh, bless you, of course not. Stale bread was too precious. Trenchers were for the upper crust. Pun most absolutely intended. Peasants dined from wooden bowls or shared pots. If someone brought a trencher, that was probably the wealthiest man in the next 3 villages. Cutlery, by the way, arrived fashionably late to the medieval dinner party. Knives were universal, not just for cutting food, but for catching rabbits, spreading cheese, and issuing threats over land disputes. Everyone had their own, usually worn on the belt. The bring-your-own-blade tradition. As for forks, they were extravagantly suspicious objects. 2-pronged devilish little things imported from Byzantium, and slow to be accepted. Some clergymen seriously considered them heretical. Can't trust a tool that pokes your food and your soul, apparently. Hands were the standard utensils, which sounds rustic and comforting, until you realize they didn't have sinks and hand washing was optional, or reserved for the occasional ceremony involving a scented bowl passed awkwardly before the meal. A sort of you may pretend to be clean now ritual. So you'd sit at a board, literally, a board on trestles, rarely a permanent table, with your bread plate, your only knife, your sticky fingers, and maybe a pewter goblet of ale, which was safer than the water and paired nicely with everything, including breakfast. Let's not skip over mealtime seating, achieved with the sort of dazzling social hierarchy that would make a modern-day wedding planner weep into their spreadsheet. Seating arrangements were power plays. The lord at the head of the table, everyone else arranged in descending order of relevance. If you were too low on the ladder, you sat by the draughts and prayed the boiled cabbage would reach you. Candles flickering, dogs skulking beneath the benches, minstrels warbling something about a doomed knight who kissed the wrong duchess. Dinner was a tapestry of scent, sound, and very questionable hygiene. And yet, somehow, out of this ruckus, rituals formed, holding your goblet a certain way, tearing bread instead of slicing, refusing seconds until the host pretended to insist. Early echoes of modern etiquette, a performance of politeness that still echoes at awkward Thanksgiving dinners today. Even burping, in some courts, was considered a compliment. Imagine that in a Michelin star review, the bœuf bourguignon was transcendent. I belched thrice. There's a dreamy comfort in knowing our ancestors survived dinner without forks or refrigeration, relying instead on trenchers, ale, and the raw belief that if the stew boils long enough, whatever's inside becomes legally edible. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, if you're still with me, let's gently rise from this grease-slicked wooden table, shake off the breadcrumbs, and tiptoe onto what dreams and dishes may come. Imagine a long, echoing hall dimly lit by flickering torchlight. The scent of roasting meats and damp stone lingers in the air. Through this haze of history and slightly questionable hygiene, we find ourselves welcome to the dinner table, or rather, the place where the table should be. For in many medieval halls, the table was less a fixed piece of furniture and more a fleeting suggestion. Two sturdy trestles, a large wooden board laid across them, and there you had it. Dinner was served. And by served, of course, we mean placed chaotically with minimal cutlery and maximum enthusiasm. Now, before we dive headlong into that first medieval bite, let's pause to consider a curious fact. The fork, that 3 or 4-pronged prince of the modern utensil drawer, was about as welcome in medieval Europe as a cat at a jousting tournament. There were knives, plenty of knives, and spoons for the enthusiastic soup slurpers. But forks? Oh no. Those were viewed with suspicion. Some even called them blasphemous, tiny metal tridents of vanity, surely only used by decadent Easterners who didn't trust their God-given fingers. Indeed, to many in the 11th century, using a fork was akin to declaring undying allegiance to Satan's cutlery drawer. It wasn't until the 16th or even 17th century that forks slowly wiggled their way into Western European mouths, not literally, we hope. Until then, fingers served just fine, especially since bread often doubled as a plate. Ah yes, the trencher. A trencher, for the uninitiated and utterly modern, was a thick slice of coarse stale bread, usually yesterday's or even the day before yesterday's, wide and firm enough to support hunks of meat, blobs of turnip mash, and suspiciously grey gravy. It absorbed the juices of the feast, becoming the spongy MVP of the meal. You could eat it afterward if you were truly hungry, or you could donate it to the poor, who weren't picky as long as there were no visible toenails in the broth. Some wealthier households did, in time, evolve past bread plates. Wooden trenchers came first, less digestible of course, but they didn't sag in the middle. Pewter ones came later, elegant to look at, and wildly impractical when they grew warm and released subtle hints of lead into your pheasant stew. A feast, it seems, always came with a touch of heavy metal. Now, let's dwell for a moment in this grand hall. The nobles lounge on straight-backed benches, elbow to elbow, sharing dishes set in the center of the board. There is no concept of my mashed root vegetables, no personal portions. Sharing food off the same plate is simply the norm. You and your neighbor scoop up bites with your knives or fingers, occasionally glaring over beet-stained knuckles when someone starts hogging the good bits. And speaking of hands, did people wash them? Well, yes, sort of. At formal meals, water would be poured over guests' hands at the table, in theory. But hand washing was more symbolic than surgical. Your average meal was blessed with a mystery garnish of previous activities: gardening, falcon handling, plague evading. The idea of using napkins or dream of dreams paper towels was centuries away. Instead, people often wiped their fingers on the tablecloth, which, in fairness, is a bold and reusable solution. Or they'd use the hem of someone else's tunic, ideally a servant's. The meal unfolded in courses, although not the neat salad to dessert arrangement we might expect. It was more like culinary jousting, courses hurled onto the table in proud succession. One moment you'd be gnawing on goose, the next confronting a pie filled with live birds, flapping with anxiety and salmonella. Feasts were long, epic even, and slow. A medieval banquet might stretch for hours, lubricated by wine, ale, and mead, ticking past the rhythm of the candlelight. There were toasts and songs, poems, and far too earnest lute performances. All the while, the great hall echoed with the sounds of slurping, cackling, belching, and the distant sigh of a bored kitchen boy, wondering when someone would invent takeaway. So as you lie back now, snug beneath your modern, crumb-free duvet, take a moment to appreciate your plate, your non-toxic plate, and your clean fork that no bishop has ever accused of witchcraft. Because tonight, our medieval meal continues right where your dreams begin, with what happens after all that shared food, spilled gravy, and dangerously warm pewter is cleared away, or very much not. As the syllables of mead-soaked songs faded in the wooden rafters of medieval halls, something rather peculiar caught the eye. Bread, masquerading as crockery. Yes, nestled between the clang of goblets and the slurp of stew. Medieval diners were eating off what we might politely call, well, edible plates. Imagine sitting down to dine by candlelight, your trencherman-sized appetite rattling the table with pent-up hunger. Before you, not a plate of porcelain or pewter, but a thick slice of dense, coarse bread. This was not some glutinous extravagance. It was a trencher, a stale slab, usually several days old, with the compressive strength of a paving stone and all the absorbent charm of a sponge in semi-retirement. Trenchers weren't just culinary plates with a crusty personality. They had a purpose: soak up all the delicious juices from whatever meat stew or pottage plopped upon them. Did they ditch the trencher after the meal? Almost. If one were noble, perhaps you dabbed the corners of your mouth with a linen napkin, or a sleeve, let's be real, offered a quiet Deo gratias, and handed your juicy, meat-soaked bread plate to a nearby pauper. Generosity, but make it medieval. And if you were not so noble, well, you might just hoist the whole trencher in your hand afterward like a medieval taco, fold it once, twice, maybe thrice, and proceed to munch your makeshift gravy sponge while making greasy eye contact with the roasted turnips. Culinary elegance at the height of functional decay. But not all dining habits involve this edible infrastructure. You see, medieval society came with its own seating chart, both literal and social. The lord of the manor would sit at a raised dais, looking down benevolently or otherwise at their guests below. The closer your seat to the dais, the better the cuts of meat, the finer the wine, and, importantly, the more likely your trencher was freshly cut and free of someone else's dinner memories. Utensils also had their social quirks. Forks, for example, were eyed with suspicion. To some, they appeared decadent, or even diabolical. Why use a dainty pitchfork when one had perfectly serviceable fingers tested over centuries of evolution and jam making? The spoon, however, reigned supreme. Crafted from wood, horn, or metal, it was the humble vessel of choice for scooping up thick stews and syllabubs. Ownership of a personal spoon became a mild badge of honor. Traveling with your own, highly encouraged. Borrowing someone else's, socially suspect and mildly unhygienic, even by 14th century standards, which is saying something. Knives too played double duty, one end for carving, one for spreading, and occasionally one for emphasizing points in a spirited conversation about church, taxes. Diners brought their own, like culinary cowboys ready for whatever piece of venison the host flung their way. Let's not forget the table manners, or the colourful lack thereof. Elbows on the table, debatable, slurping, entirely acceptable if the potage was good enough. Picking teeth with your dagger, slightly frowned upon. And there were rules, of course. Don't drink from the communal cup before your betters. Don't double dip your bread. And please, for the love of St. Swithin, do not lick your knife in public. While feast dazzled with edible pageantry, everyday medieval meals were far more predictable and, dare we say it, comforting in their humble repetition. Peasant families nibbled black rye bread as tough as philosophy homework, dipped in oniony cabbage brew, and punctuated by ale as warm and flat as the conversation around it. It was a subsistence lifestyle, yes, but one where even routine meals carried tradition and the faintest hint of imaginative spice, usually imported at terrifying cost from lands far beyond the manor fields. Curiously, some of these habits slip slyly into modern life. That wooden cutting board you serve cheese on, medieval charcuterie chic, eating soup with a spoon you treasure for its perfectly curved edge. A quiet nod to ancestral spoon pride. Sharing bread at the dinner table, tearing warm chunks and passing them with laughter. Well, that's an echo of a tradition not easily forgotten. But as our evening table fades gently into shadow and the trencher of time soaks in the gravy of history, another curious detail quietly awaits. Something about table salt, superstition, and the precise angle of your arm while reaching across a high table. In the twinkling, candle-lit hush of a medieval hall, long before the idea of central heating or pizza delivery, there floated an aroma both curious and comforting. Roasted meats, warm breads, and something herbal wafting from trenches so old they'd seen more history than your grandmother's soup tureen. Ah yes, trenchers. Perhaps you've heard of them. Those edible, and sometimes distressingly inedible, proto-plates fashioned from stale bread, usually a day or two past its prime, and somewhere between a dinner roll and a roofing tile in texture. Delicious. Not fantastically. Functional. Quite. These humble, doughy discs were the culinary middle managers of the medieval dinner table, solemnly shouldering the weight of stews and sauces and whatever other medieval mystery meat had been ladled upon them. Constructed typically from coarse rye or wheat bread, a trencher had one job: hold food without collapsing. They were sturdy, but not showy. The George Costanza of dinnerware. A thick slice cut, not too soft, not too brittle, and just dry enough not to soak through in the first few bites. Now, here's the delightful twist. If you were fancy, say, a nobleman with land, titles, and a codpiece that made statements at the banquet, you weren't expected to eat your trencher. No, that would be gauche. Instead, after the meal, your soggy bread plate, rich with the juices of meat and the ghost of garlic, was donated to the local poor. Charity, yes, but also a peculiar culinary trickle-down economy. For those lower on the great medieval food chain, the trencher became the surprise second course. Imagine it. You missed dinner, but someone gifted you a gravy-kissed wedge of rye, pre-sauced by a high-born stomach just hours before. Somehow both generous and slightly questionable. It was charity with seasoning. Of course, trenchers weren't universal. Wooden and pewter plates were also in the mix, especially as culinary sophistication tiptoed its way across the centuries. But bread trenchers held their ground for quite a while, especially at large feasts and gatherings that needed disposable dinnerware before disposal was a formal concept. No cleanup, just compost, with theological overtones. And speaking of compostability, we find ourselves drifting into the era's noble insistence on sharing. Plates could be common property, typically one trencher between two people. And in such proximity, you not only shared food, you shared opinions, backwash, and the odd chance of catching your partner's cold. Romantic, isn't it? One goblet, two mouths, and a questionable understanding of germs. Yes, medieval dining was delightfully community-oriented. Everyone from knights to kitchen boys was used to the closeness, the communal clatter, the oddly specific rules about using only 3 fingers for certain foods. Pinkies, for instance, were scarcely invited to the party at all. Keep them clean, for scratching one's nose was considered nearly sacred. But back to trenchers, the edible icon itself. Somewhere amidst the candle smoke and mead breath, they began to evolve. By the 15th century, a sharper, dare we say, more competitive plate entered the culinary court, the manchette. This was a finer white bread, beloved by the upper crust, pun wholly intended. And though less suited to sauce absorption and charitable redistribution, it whispered of sophistication. Still, the old trencher held on, the carb plate that refused to be clattered aside. To this day, its culinary spirit endures in ways that are surprisingly familiar. Have you ever devoured chili served in a hollowed-out boule at a cozy cafe and called it artisanal? That's basically a trencher, rebranded as haute cuisine in a sourdough sweater, flatbreads, open-faced sandwiches, the eternal allure of edible receptacles. They trace their ancestry back to our eye-old friend, crusted and crusty, doing its part in medieval mealtime logistics. With the ember glow of a forgotten hall flickering in our imagination, and the sound of a dull knife soaring through a day-old loaf echoing like gentle thunder, let's drift gently onward. For what came next in the evolution of dining took not only sharper knives, but also sharper tongues, where table manners revealed far more than who had the fanciest fork. Across smoky hallways of ancient European kitchens, while roosters gossiped in the courtyard and bread dough dreamed peacefully by the hearth, something remarkable was afoot. Soup was quietly ruling the medieval dinner table. Yes, soup, humble, brothy, often misunderstood, was not just a sidekick, not just something to tide one over until someone roasted a pig. In medieval times, soup was the main event. A ladle of meat-warmed broth could travel across class divisions, stretching from the lowliest peasant's cauldron to the ornate table of a noble serenaded by minstrels and indigestion. You see, long before most folks could afford proper utensils, soup, or more precisely, pottage, was a kind of edible democracy. It required little more than water, hope, a fire, and whatever miscellaneous barnyard ingredients hadn't trotted away yet. Leeks, herbs, roots, and maybe, if fortune smiled, bits of bacon or wild bird legs bobbing around like lazy ducks at an afternoon pond party. Pottage simmered slowly over open fires for hours, or even days, because time in the medieval kitchen was more circular than linear. You didn't make dinner. You kept it simmering indefinitely and occasionally whispered into it. Meals became tender rituals of arrival and departure. If dinner was ready now, it probably had been yesterday, and it might be again tomorrow. The beauty of this eternal stewing was its simplicity. For peasants with fewer spoons than neighbours and dinnerware that might double as roofing tile, bowls were often carved from wood and more often than not shared communally. Eating was interactive. One might eat from a shared pot, dipping in pieces of stale bread to soak up broth, a survival tactic that also conveniently transformed old crusts into drunken, floppy cushions of flavour. But the real culinary sleeper hit of this pottage-centric age was the trencher. Ah, the trencher. Medieval cuisine's quirky cousin to the modern-day dinner plate. At first glance, it might appear someone went to set the table, but got distracted halfway through and just plonked a half loaf of bread in front of everyone instead, which is precisely what happened really. Trenchers were thick slices of stale bread, several days aged for optimal hardness and mild resentment. These edible plates soaked up whatever stew or goo was ladled their way. After the meal, you could eat your plate, or, if you were feeling generous, or full and didn't want to insult the cook, you could donate your gooey leftovers and soggy trenchers to the poor, who were often waiting outside like medieval Uber Eats, minus the delivery bags and branding. And yet, in the great candlelit halls of lords and countesses, the process grew more refined, if no less mushy. Trenchers at noble feasts often came as part of place settings complete with fine embroidery, silver goblets, and someone named Lionel who played the lute distressingly often. These hardened bread slabs absorbed richly spiced gravies and dripping meats until they resembled medieval lasagna layers. Of course, no mention of soup or trenchers is complete without noting that no one quite knew where to put a spoon. Spoons existed, yes, but not everyone owned one. Spoons were passed down through families like treasured heirlooms. Imagine inheriting your grandfather's soup spoon, lovingly polished and possibly engraved with a crest or a reminder not to chew the metal. Knives were common. They were personal tools, far more for stabbing than slicing, and carried on belts like culinary sidearms. Forks, however, were practically accused of witchcraft until the 16th century. They looked a little too pitchforky, a little too devil-adjacent. So meals mostly involved a delicate dance involving knives, bread, shared bowls, and the occasional hand. And the broth. Always the broth. So next time you dip your spoon into a bowl of nostalgic chicken noodle, remember, you're participating in a 1,000-year-old tradition of warm, brothy fellowship. You're reminding the ghost of a medieval cook that their eternal stew is still bubbling in the modern soul. Bread may have evolved from trencher to toast, but the love of dipping something solid into something soupy remains delightfully unchanged. Now, with the scent of roasted onions and bubbling bone broth beginning to soften at the edges of your thoughts, we'll gently wander from the cook's hearth to another fragrant corner of the medieval table, where the cheese begins to whisper secrets. If you had wandered into a medieval kitchen, say sometime in the 13th century, you might have been overwhelmed by the aromas before catching sight of anything at all. There would have been bubbling cauldrons, slabs of smoked meat hanging from beams like sleepy bats, and possibly a turnspit dog, yes, an actual dog, trained to trot in a wheel that turned the spit roast. A furry sous chef, if you will. But we're not here to adopt a medieval cooking pup, however tempting that may be. No, tonight, dear listener, we're pulling up a well-worn wooden bench next to the big, crackling hearth and settling in for a light exploration of one of the most surprising quirks of medieval dining: how much of your food you didn't eat, and why cheese might have once been more controversial than politics at a family dinner. Let us begin, tenderly and slowly, with the concept of the trencher. Not a sword, although that would make dinner lively. A trencher was, in fact, your plate, or rather, an edible and often stale slice of yesterday's bread, used as a base on which food was ladled or plopped, depending on the enthusiasm of your server. Meals served upon crunchy carbohydrate. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of the edible taco salad bowl, but flatter, drabber, and, well, significantly grittier. Now, trenchers were technically edible, but unless you were utterly famished or possessed the appetite of a wood chipper, you typically didn't eat yours. It had spent the whole meal soaking in sauce, meat grease, and mysteries. When the feast wound down, these soggy slabs were gathered and often donated to the poor, sometimes generously, and sometimes in the way one generously donates a collection of single socks and uncharged electronics. Still, intent counted. Beyond the warm glow of shared trenchers, however, loomed the rules of what could and couldn't make it to the table. And this, dear dreamer, is where food philosophy and medieval digestion had an oddly spiritual marriage. There existed a hierarchy of foods. Some were considered noble, and not just because they appeared on lordly silverware. No, there were actual theories, handwritten with reverence and probably a quill, that certain foods were closer to perfection. Peacocks, for example. They were rarely eaten, roasted mostly for theatrical flair, served upright with their feathers reattached, as if the bird had risen, slightly crispier, from its own ashes. A phoenix entree. And then there were humbler foods: onions, garlic, and beans. Flavoursome, yes, but viewed, how shall we say, less aristocratically because of their association with the more effusive aspects of digestion. A polite way of saying they were gas grenades in a banquet setting. But then there was cheese. Now, you may think of cheese as a cozy snack, or your fridge's most passive-aggressive resident, always just one expiration date shyer than expected. But in medieval times, cheese developed a bit of a reputation. Some early medical texts categorized it as dangerous, heavy, ambiguous, potentially unsettling to one's humors, not emotions, bodily humors, blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, the four stooges of health in pre-modern Europe. So suspicious was some scholarly cheese thought that medical advice frequently recommended avoiding it unless you specifically wanted to feel bloated, ill-tempered, or lethargic. If that sounds familiar, it may be because the early critics of cheese were, in effect, describing an overly ambitious charcuterie brunch. Still, despite skepticism, cheese remained popular. After all, how many things in life are both forbidden and delicious? Medieval monks might have debated its moral and medical implications by day, only to nibble a sliver by candlelight at midnight. Scandalous dairy diplomacy. Even more fascinating was the relationship between table manners and identity. In some noble courts, the way you held your spoon could place you as solid marriage material, or exiled to the dullest end of the banquet table. Napkins were a statement of wealth, and elbows, contrary to the modern rule, weren't necessarily unwelcome if you were the lord of the manor. Elbow sprawl was, after all, a medieval portrayal of dominance. So as you gently drift, picture it: a candlelit table too wide for whispered secrets, goblets filled with spiced wine, trenchers softening under duck stew, peasants whispering thanks for leftover crusts, and a nobleman cautiously eyeing his wedge of cheese, wondering if this delicacy was about to tip his humours out of balance. As the fire dims and the dog-shaped kitchen assistant curls into a sleepy coil by the hearth, we turn our thoughts toward the sweet part of the medieval meal, desserts, spices, and how sugar went from rare treasure to royal obsession. In the Jiedche flickering halos of candlelight across a medieval feast, there emerges an unmistakable character, the spoon. Oh yes, the humble ladles lad, the quiet cousin of the great and boisterous knife. In our time, we take it for granted, a standard resident of the utensil drawer. But in medieval Europe, the spoon lived an entirely more dramatic life, often misunderstood, occasionally revered, and surprisingly, portable. You might picture a medieval table groaning under the weight of stews, porridges, and whatever the cook confidently labelled potage du jour. These were the days before lasagna layers and salad forks. Meals had fewer courses, fewer rules, but absolutely no shortage of dribble-prone foods. Enter the spoon, the one true aid to scooping, sipping, and not scalding one's lower chin on bubbling oat goo. But, unlike today's mass-produced stainless steel top-drawer dwellers, a good spoon in the 12th or 13th century was personal property. People didn't automatically get one with the meal. If you were a somewhat respectable person, not necessarily a lord, just someone who bathed annually, you carried your own spoon with you, often tied to your belt or kept in a pouch, alongside other medieval essentials like a bit of cheese, wax tablets, or the ever-popular ball of random string. This gave rise to the charming and slightly absurd cultural detail of people pulling out their spoons like secret agents unsheathing miniature swords. Dinner at your neighbour's hut, out came the spoon. Visiting a lord's keep, you're not just bringing wine, you're bringing your trusty, well-worn pearwood spoon, carved by Uncle Edgar, blessed by a friar, and likely a bit sticky from the last bowl of bean broth. And what's more, spoons were more than scooping tools. They were social indicators. A silver spoon wasn't just for looking posh while offending the rice pudding. It was a genuine expression of wealth, lineage, and somewhat confusingly, your mother's hope that you'd marry better. Silver spoons also made for prime christening gifts, a symbolic promise that the child would grow up never having to share pottage with peasants. Of course, some babies promptly drooled on these status symbols and dropped them into the nearest pig trough, thereby humbling the entire practice. Carrying one's own spoon did come with inherent risks. Forget it at home, and you're slurping stew with your hands like a bandit. Lose it at dinner, and you're bound to be accused of thievery or sorcery. There are at least 3 documented medieval church rulings related to disputes over spoon ownership, mostly ending in someone swearing on a saint's toe bone that the spoon was actually theirs. Now, for the medieval working folk, spoons weren't always gleaming. Most were turned from wood, ash, beech, or boxwood if you were lucky, carved with care and maybe a little decorative flourish. The handles were sometimes etched with initials, small crosses, or ominous little faces, possibly to make the porridge more entertaining. And in communal dining, which most people couldn't avoid, spoons weren't just a utensil. They were a signal of good manners. The unwritten rule was 1 spoonful. Pass the bowl. An etiquette ballet where rhythm and courtesy met, and occasionally collided in stewy chaos. Even the church had a hand in the matter. Monks were known to eat in silence, using finely crafted spoons to consume their simple meals in contemplative quiet, probably reflecting not only on scripture, but also on how weirdly satisfying it is to scoop lentils, And imagine this. In some courts, noblemen had entire spoon sets commissioned for travel, rolled up neatly in leather pouches, the original cutlery to go. Going on pilgrimage. Don't forget your holy spoon. Some were even engraved with prayers, because if you're going to eat suspicious fish stew on the road to Canterbury, divine backup never hurts. Today, you might reach for your spoon without so much as a second thought. But once, carrying that curved bit of usefulness was akin to showing up to battle with your sword properly oiled. At the medieval table, life required tools, and the spoon, polished, carved, or just a simple dip of wood, was the unsung hero slurping quietly beside kings and commoners alike. And just beyond the spoon, soft and glistening under candlelight, awaits the curious case of salt. Not just a seasoning, but a medieval power symbol. Let's wander that way. It is a little known yet entirely delightful truth that medieval kitchens were less about culinary flair and more about not dying of food poisoning. That said, chefs, or rather cooks, of the Middle Ages did wield a surprising degree of influence, especially if they were good at roasting pigeons while dodging the occasional collapsing ceiling beam. Kitchens in medieval Europe were equal parts chaos and pageantry, and their legacy still flickers warmly beneath our modern stovetops, like a faint whisper of boiling onions and overcooked stew. Now, before we step into the smoky kitchen of a 14th century English manor, let's dim the flame a little and imagine the scene. The castle is stone, draughty, and unapologetically echoey. Somewhere above, noble lords are arguing over who stole whose falcon. But down below, in the realm of copper pots and soot-stained hearths, the cooks are fighting a more noble battle, coaxing edible meals out of questionable lumps of mutton and the week's least rotten cabbages. Meat, you see, was a status symbol. The more legs it had, the higher your status. Nobles dined on swan, peacock, and sometimes porpoise, which is both a fish and, frankly, a red flag. These meats weren't just grilled. Oh no. They were roasted whole, glazed for shine, and then sometimes dressed back up in their own feathers for serving. Because nothing says fancy dinner like a flambéed goose wearing its own past. But the real heart, or better yet, the stomach, of the meal was stews. Pottage, as it was called, was essentially a thick soup made of whatever was lying around: onions, leeks, bits of barley, a splash of broth, and the kind of mystery meat that probably didn't pass any modern-day inspection. Think of it as the original slow cooker meal, only less crock-pot and more cauldron on a fire pit built by a tired apprentice. The tools were as rustic as the recipes. Knives were precious and few, and mostly brought by the guest, making dinner parties not just a meal, but also a low-stakes weaponry exhibition. Forks, interestingly, were not in vogue. To many, they were scandalous little devil prongs. Using a fork in polite company could earn you suspicious glances, and in Italy, possibly an accusation of vanity. Better to use fingers, five-pronged, God-given instruments perfected over years of bread dunking. Speaking of dunking things, bread in medieval kitchens wasn't just food, it was infrastructure. Trenchers, those thick slabs of stale bread used as plates, served as both a dish and eventually a digestible doggy bag. Once you finished your stew, soaked up all the juices with your trencher, and dabbed your chin with the sleeve of your finest woolen tunic, you could either eat the bread dish or donate it to the poor. It was a biodegradable innovation centuries ahead of its time. And of course, no medieval kitchen tale is complete without spices. Those precious pinches of status carried across deserts, oceans, and occasionally steep bargaining conditions with suspicious Phoenicians. Black pepper was gold dust. Cinnamon travelled further than most serfs ever could. And saffron. Saffron was the stuff of dreams and yellow soups. A well-seasoned dish wasn't just tasty, it was political. Say what you will about medieval cuisine, but it certainly knew how to make a statement. Even desserts weren't safe from symbolism. Custards, jellies, and spice fruits appeared in dazzling arrays, often presented like little edible tapestries. Not that they were particularly delicious, mind you. Thickened with almond milk, decorated with pine nuts, and often containing puzzling quantities of vinegar, they were more about colour and shape than flavour. One popular sweet dish, known as leech, was essentially gelatinous milk with sugar, sometimes moulded into battlements, roses, or other things you probably never wanted to eat in gelatin form. By the end of the medieval meal, the kitchen's wooden counters would be streaked with grease, spice smoke would cling to the rafters, and the cooks, often nimble, battered, and thoroughly underappreciated, would begin scrubbing the cauldrons that had lovingly overboiled most of dinner. Remarkably, the lineage of these modest inventions and flourishes, from the communal stew pot to the flavour ambitions of spicy rabbit, lingers even today. So next time you're toasting croutons or experimenting with leftover casserole, you may be taking part in a culinary tradition that Queen Eleanor once failed to politely eat with only 2 fingers. And as the fire dims and the bread trencher crumbles, we'll gently wander from the steamy kitchens into the quieter corners of medieval dining. Perhaps it's time, just perhaps, to peek at what exactly passed for etiquette once the plates were served and fingers, heaven help us, were in motion. Beneath the flickering torchlight of the dining hall, the medieval table stretched long and wide, lined with trenchers of stale bread and hopeful nobles waiting for a pigeon that had been stewed slightly too long. But while the grand banquets of kings and queens tend to steal the spotlight, let us tiptoe tonight beyond the dripping chandeliers of the upper echelons and peer, quietly, reverently, into the more humble medieval kitchens, the home hearths, where most people didn't dine on golden goblets, but on something rather wheatier. You see, in the Middle Ages, dining wasn't just about consumption. It was an event, a performance, a balancing act between social rules, religious restrictions, and the ever-disobedient humours of roasted cabbage. But central to every bite was the bread, not merely as something edible, but as architecture. Quite literally. Enter the trencher. Imagine a thick, crusty slab of bread, flat and wide, doing its best impression of a wooden plate. There it sat, noble and uncomplaining, catching juices from roast meats and gathering heaps of grain stews and spills, all before being eaten itself, passed to the poor, or, if particularly soggy, tossed to the dogs. It was both plate and sponge. Medieval dining efficiency at its finest. Now, as delightful as this bread-based dinnerware was, it had its limits. Eventually, wood and metal plates became more common, especially for the upper crust, if you will. But the humble trencher clung to its role. You'll still find its legacy. Today, the edible plate lives on in taco shells, rice bowls, and that one rare sandwich, where someone uses a donut as the base and insists it's fusion. The medieval cook would have chuckled, then nodded in agreement. But let us turn our attention, gently, to etiquette. For it was not enough to eat your pottage. Oh no, one had to eat it correctly. And by correctly, we mean without offending your dinner partner's delicate sensibilities, or worse, their nose. For instance, never, under any circumstance, should one place one's elbow on the table, not because it was rude by modern manners, but because elbows were often filthy, and the table might be shared with 6 other people, all digging into the same communal dish. Also, one might accidentally knock a spoon into the stew, and then you're suddenly fishing with your fingers. An absolute faux pas. Then there's the curious case of salt, a symbol of status and seating. Salt was precious, and those seated above the salt were considered high-ranking, while those below the salt were, well, probably not reading from illuminated manuscripts in their spare time. The placement of salt at a medieval table could stir quiet shame, powerful envy, or an insatiable urge to oversalt one's cabbage just to rebel. Importantly, fingers were perfectly acceptable utensils. Knives were used, yes, especially personal ones carried in a sheath. But forks? Oh, forks were suspect for quite some time. They entered Europe via Byzantium, or possibly the Italian courts, and were originally met with disdain. What kind of person, people wondered, does not trust the God-given tools at the ends of their own arms? To use a fork in the early medieval world would be akin to bringing a selfie stick to an art gallery, technically permissible, but spiritually unsettling. It wasn't until centuries later that forks would stab their place into common dining. Ever helpful, servants often stood behind diners, ready with basins and towels so guests could rinse their fingers between courses. This ritual ensured that soup wasn't seasoned with yesterday's fish, and it's a charmingly medieval answer to our modern hand sanitizer obsession. They may not have had Purell, but they had a surprisingly strong commitment to hand hygiene, provided you had access to a servant. Meanwhile, the courses flowed at a proper feast, not one by one as we do today, but in great waves. A remove of multiple dishes swept across the table at once. Pies beside fish, next to puddings, beside other pies. The meal was not a soloist's performance. It was a full-blown orchestra of roasting and boiling and sweetmeats. No 2 bites guaranteed to match, and the boldest diners didn't mind. And perhaps most wonderfully absurd of all, some tables even had their own assigned music. That's right. A meal might be serenaded by a lute player or a psaltery strummer, strumming something vaguely courtly while your chicken was being carved, tableside. Dining was sensory and ceremonial, an experience that looked a little like feasting and a little like medieval theatre with gravy. So tonight, as you recline farther into sleep, imagine a long trestle table in a candlelit chamber. Hear the gentle clink of spoons, feel the warmth of a fire, sense the watchful eye of a tapestry tiger nearby. And as the music fades softly into the pause between courses, we prepare to slip quietly into another dreamy dining tradition of old. The medieval table could be a curious theatre. No velvet curtains, but there were plenty of linens, occasionally washed. Its players didn't need scripts. They followed the choreography of custom and appetite. As the candlelight flickered and danced across wooden beams and trenches alike, every movement had a role in the play of mealtime etiquette, or the lack thereof. Tonight, our tale sinks gently into the curious napkin rituals of the Middle Ages, along with the delightful quirks of who wiped what and where. Now, before forks became the fashionable darlings of the dining world, fingers were doing all the heavy lifting. And when fingers are the primary utensils, well, things can get beautifully messy, albeit in a way that makes modern dinner guests shudder just a little. So, enter the humble napkin, or perhaps more accurately, the array of loosely napkin-shaped objects. Individual napkins, the ones folded primly on plates today, weren't common practice for most folks. Instead, larger cloths, shared by a few guests or even the whole table, served as those early hand-and-mouth saviors. Imagine this. You're seated at a feast in a manor hall. A roasted peacock gazes at you with a disturbingly lifelike expression, its feathers reattached for grandeur. You've torn a hunk of bread with your hands, wiped your fingers on your doublet cuffs, tisk, not proper, and finally reach for the communal towel strung along the edge of the table. It's already a little damp, from someone else's enthusiasm with stew. Cozy. For those ranking a bit higher on the social totem pole, lords, ladies, and the occasional bishop with sauce in his beard, napkin practices could become rather ceremonial. A personal towel might be presented, draped artistically over one shoulder by a serving boy who probably hadn't blinked in 3 hours. And just as you begin to relax at this grand hall of finger-licking rituals, let us step quietly into kitchens, both bustling and smoky, where culinary tools weren't made of stainless steel, but iron, earthenware, and the occasional giant spoon you could row a boat with. Here, napkins took a backseat to sleeves and aprons. Kitchen hands were more concerned with not spilling boiling gruel on their shoes than keeping a pristine cloth. Many of the eating traditions that we would consider rude now weren't just tolerated. They were a sign of proper station. For instance, it was perfectly acceptable for someone of noble status to blow their nose at the table, not into a tissue, mind you, but often into the table linen, or in some cases, merely onto the floor. The logic? Hygiene had not quite met its golden age, and besides, a medieval floor was essentially a well-dressed compost pile. Straw, herbs, fragments of dinner past, all mixed together in a rustic cocktail beneath your seat. Now, a particularly enchanting element of medieval dining decorum was the concept of washing hands before and after meals. This was not done simply with water and soap, but with the assistance of beautifully crafted ewers and basins. The ritual was often accompanied by a servant pouring scented water over your fingers, which would then be dried, not with your tunic, but with a fine cloth, sometimes embossed with your family's heraldry, if you were the sort who had heraldry to emboss things with. Interestingly, this pre-meal washing wasn't entirely due to a widespread love of cleanliness. It was, in large part, ceremonial. A bit of performative purity before diving into the duck pie. The after-meal hand-washing held more practical value, given the greasy nature of most medieval fare. And if you're wondering if they believed germs lived on their fingers, no, not exactly. Germ theory wouldn't arrive on the intellectual table for centuries, clinking its glass awkwardly and asking if it was too late to RSVP. But this didn't stop medieval diners from developing systems of hygiene by hierarchy. The cleanest cuts of meat, the driest corners of the napkin, and the least scandalous parts of the shared spoon went to those of higher status. It wasn't just eating, it was status signaling in 4 courses, with a bit of mutton in your teeth. So much of what graced the medieval table was about performance. Who got to use what, who wiped where, and who was gently reminded that belching wasn't necessarily a mark of gratitude, unless, of course, you were in the Germanic tribes, in which case, burp away. And so the candlelight flickered lower, the tablecloth stained with sauce, and the soft, half-chewed dreams of feasting hands. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the fading echo of laughter, belches, and the rustle of a shared napkin in good company. Let's rise now, not hurriedly, mind you, from this warm hall of cloth and ceremony, and wander toward the quiet art of seasoning, where spices told stories and salt wasn't merely for fries, but for feudal power. Shh, onward we go, It is a common folly of the modern age to believe that finger foods are a quirky invention of sports bars and trendy birthday parties. Oh no, dear listener. The origins of picking at dinner without the clumsy interference of cutlery stretch far back, past cocktail sausages and into the fire-lit feasting halls of medieval Europe. Yes, once upon a pudding-stained time, utensils were not so much optional as they were the rare luxury of the unusually sophisticated, or perhaps just the overly paranoid. In truth, medieval folk ate with their hands, and they did so with great enthusiasm and a somewhat alarming tolerance for communal germs. The notion of a place setting as we know it today would have seemed laughably indulgent. Forks were basically rumours. Spoons existed, yes, but mostly for soup, porridge, or as small shovels for opportunists. Knives? They were present, but you were expected to bring your own, like a noble Swiss army guest, prepared to slice your meat and fend off any ambitious trencherman who might eye your portion too fondly. And then there were the trenchers. Ah, the trencher. A doubly humble and heroic loaf of bread made not for eating, but for enduring. Picture it. Thick slabs of stale bread, wide and tough like edible dinner plates. Meals would be served directly onto these trencher slices, which were sturdy enough to survive a pour of hot stew or a generous dollop of meat gravy. After all, the meal, if the slices hadn't dissolved into a culinary bog, they were either consumed or, more commonly, given to the poor. A noble redistribution of grease and carbs. You see, in a world before dishwashers, the trencher was the unsung hero of hygiene and economy. One might imagine the bread eventually rising up in protest. I was baked for nourishment, not as a plate for roast goose. But alas, no such revolt ever came, though many a squire did revolt from ingesting a trencher soaked in 3-day-old gravy. And speaking of the communal nature of things, sharing a trencher with your neighbour was not uncommon. In fact, it was a mark of politeness, or perhaps just an ancient form of passive aggression. Consider the subtle psychological warfare of one diner quietly scooping more than their half of the trencher's toppings. Therein lay the earliest origins of modern roommate squabbles. Napkins, merely a dream. Sleeves, beards, and convenient corners of the tablecloth bore the burden of sticky fingers and errant sauces. This was not the era of please pass the moist towelette. It was the era of wipe thy hands on thy tunic and be done with it. Interestingly, the hands-on approach to dining had, in its own greasy way, an etiquette. You weren't to shove both hands in like a crazed raccoon. No, only the 3 fingers of the right hand were to be used, at least in polite company. Using your whole hand, that was reserved for private moments or particularly slippery eels. There were even manuals for this, guides to good manners, reminding aspiring nobles to wash their hands before the meal, lest they be mistaken for a blacksmith who's wrestled a chimney. As the centuries rolled on and the Renaissance dawned, forks began to sneak into the dining room, not as flamboyant conquistadors, but more like awkward guests no one had invited. In England, as late as the 1600s, a person using a fork might be viewed with suspicion. Why bother with little silver prongs when the good Lord gave you fingers at birth and sleeves shortly afterward? But slowly, the fork gained favour, partially due to fashion imported from Italy, where cultured nobles found it charming to twirl pasta on tiny tridents. The idea caught on, albeit slowly, much like the time it takes for a trencher to soak through. Still, even now, in the glow of modernity, we secretly channel our medieval ancestors. Just look at the way we dive into a bucket of fried chicken or nibble pizza slices by hand, our fingers glistening and unapologetic. The essence of the trencher lives on. Not in bread, perhaps, but in cardboard boxes and shared servings. And so, as the candlelight flickers across an imagined long table of the Middle Ages, where hounds doze at the foot of chairs and minstrels play beneath the clatter of bones and laughter, we close this page of communal plates and humble hands and drift forward, gently, into the next quiet quirk of eating through history. Imagine, if you will, a hall filled with low flickering candlelight, the scent of roasted meat and stale ale thick in the air, and a long, slightly sticky oak table where elbows are not just allowed, but almost structurally necessary. Welcome to the medieval banquet, where etiquette was measured in crumbs and rank, and where knives outnumbered forks by something like 1,000 years to one. Yes, tonight, we lie back among the feasting greats and the not-so-greats and take a closer look at the humble eating knife, the indispensable blade of the medieval dining experience. Part cutlery, part status symbol, part potential weapon, it is the forgotten ancestor of your modern steak knife, minus the dishwasher-safe handle. Now, before we get too cozy with the cold steel of history, let's establish something important. In medieval Europe, no one expected the host to hand you a knife. You were meant to bring your own. This personal dining knife, known modestly as your trench knife or eating knife, was the Swiss Army knife of the feasting world, sharp, ready, and usually tucked into your belt, right next to the breadcrumbs and your last scrap of dignity. These knives were slim, single-edged, and about as subtle as a political insult at a family dinner. You might use it to cut your meat, spear a hunk of cheese, slice a bit of bread, and if conversation slowed, perhaps whittle a stick. Not joking. Entertainment was scarce, and pointy objects were ripe for mischief. Interestingly, one of the oldest social gestures involving knives didn't involve stabbing. Rather, it was the act of sharing your knife with someone else at the table. Lending your blade to a guest who'd forgotten theirs wasn't just polite. It was the medieval version of offering someone your Netflix password, a sign of camaraderie, trust, and a mild gamble on your fingers not being bitten. Now, you might wonder, where were the forks in all this? Weren't people tired of chasing peas across flat trenches with a knife in their bare hands? Tender listener, let me assure you, peas were not a common mealtime problem. Medieval diets were hearty, meat-heavy, and generally large enough that fine motor skills were optional. You ate your food in slabs, not spoonfuls. And for those rare moments where scooping was necessary, your fingers were right there, cleanish and conveniently attached. The fork did exist, tiny and two-pronged, but it was more likely to show up at a Byzantine wedding than an English feast. In most parts of Europe, forks were viewed with suspicion. They looked foreign, fiddly, and vaguely sinful. Some even believed it prideful to use a fork, when God had already given you perfectly good ones, 10 of them in fact, split evenly between your two hands. So the knife it was. But not all knives were created equal. A nobleman's knife might be etched, gilded, even adorned with a jewel or two, just in case the venison wasn't impressive enough on its own. A peasant's knife was probably a simple iron blade, often the same one he used for everything from carving his dinner to trimming kindling to, on unfortunate days, fending off overly territorial geese. Each knife had a story. Some were passed down through generations. Others had suspicious nicks and stains that looked historical, but probably weren't. In any case, Knives spoke volumes about the diner. Were they practical, rich, slightly dangerous? All of the above. A man's knife said more about him than his surname, particularly in the taverns of 14th century France. And speaking of France, dear skeptical France, they must be credited eventually for taming the table knife. In the 1600s, Cardinal Richelieu, yes, the same schemer who haunted the Three Musketeers, decided he was simply too elegant to watch his dinner guests pick their teeth with pointy blades. So he had the tips of all table knives ground off. Rounded tips became the fashionable mark of gentility. And later, Louis XIV took the concept national, banning pointed knives at the dinner table altogether, ostensibly to reduce violence, but also because, well, butter was easier to spread without a blade shaped like a dagger. And so, over a century or two, the eating knife transformed from a personal, always carried sliver of steel to a set piece at a shared table. From tusked pig parts to roast duck, its purpose remained the same: to bridge the divide between food and face with as little bloodshed as dignity permitted. As we soften our glance and drift further into velvety darkness, let your ears rest on the quiet jingle of a knife sliding back into its sheath, and the distant echo of a peasant's belly full of turnip stew. Soon another utensil will vie for the medieval spotlight, one that shaped not only meals, but entire social cues. But for now, let the blade rest. Sleep gently, dear listener. There was an oddly heroic quality to the fork's arrival in medieval Europe, an unassuming tined interloper that caused more scandal than, say, a war or two. To our modern sensibilities, it's just a bit of polished metal with a sarcastic attitude about soup. But back in the Middle Ages, this dainty device was viewed with deep suspicion and the moral weight of an unbaptized salad. Picture this. You are at a feast in 11th century Byzantium. The candles flicker like tiny torches of gossip. The table is a chaotic garden of Parmesan delights. And there she is, Theodora Dukaina, niece of the Byzantine emperor, plucking morsels of food with a fork, like a startled aristocratic squirrel. The whispers begin immediately. Her use of this two-pronged foreign utensil scandalized the pious Venetians, who found it not only unnecessary but deeply unchristian. God, they muttered, solemnly wiping grease from their fingers with their cloaks, has already provided you with a perfect pair of forks. Your fingers, yes, fingers. Medieval guests were not shy about diving knuckle-deep into their trencherfuls. You see, trenchers were not plates as we have today, but hearty slabs of stale bread, meals served on meals like an edible napkin destiny. The soft bits soaked up gravy and greasy stew until the bread became either a second course or a charitable donation to the nearest peasant, monk, or dog with above-average manners. But the point is, cutlery was optional, and when you're wrist-deep in a reed basket of roast goose, the fork seems like an affectation, maybe even witchcraft. It took a while for continental Europe to warm up to the idea of the fork. Knives and spoons, mind you, had earned their stripes. Knives were not just for carving meat, they were status symbols. A well-dressed lord might bring his own elegantly sheathed knife to a feast and gently wave it in the air like a conductor composing a sonata of lamb shank. The spoon, meanwhile, had the humble dignity of the church, used for gruel, pottage, and the various brown puddings that defy description and, thankfully, camera. But the fork was exotic, sinful even, especially when early versions had just two tines, making them look a bit like Satan's fondue accessory. It wasn't until the late Renaissance that the fork finally started winning hearts and napkins outside of Southern Europe. Catherine de' Medici, arriving in France from Italy in the 16th century, brought her Florentine forks with her, and a whole load of scandalized dinner guests mumbling that she might as well be summoning demons while stirring her macaroni. Interestingly, food etiquette often evolved alongside fashion. In the earlier Middle Ages, sleeves were long and open, perfect for dragging your tunic through a communal stew and consuming both dinner and fibre simultaneously. Cleaning one's hands became part of the courtly ritual. Gallant knights would rinse fingers in perfumed water any time they committed culinary crimes, which, given the slipperiness of eel pie, happened more often than you'd think. Menus began to diversify. Pastry crusts became more ornamental than functional, and slowly, but irresistibly, the utensils crept in. By the 17th century, the fork became less a tool of decadence and more a polite necessity. France eventually made it fashionable. England, at first, mocked it, of course. But even George V was caught, forking his way through his roast duck, by the time he grew tired of greasy thumbprints on his breeches. All this to say, the small silver prong we nonchalantly jab into our Tuesday pasta had to endure centuries of suspicion, ecclesiastical side-eye, and truly soggy trenches to earn its place on the table. But even as the fork finally took its throne, another quiet revolution was underway, a shift not in what people used to eat, but how they sat while doing it. For while most medieval folk dined on benches, or simply stood around a trestle table, nibbling and gossiping, an outsider was sneaking into the picture. The chair, that domesticated throne of bottom comfort. And with that, we'll gently adjust our seat cushions and fluff our historical pillows, letting our thoughts wander toward the curious evolution of medieval seating. What's the best way to sit through a 6-hour feast when corseted, armored, or simply tired? Well now, that's an excellent tale for a little later on. The medieval napkin was not, as one might hope, a gracefully folded square of linen embroidered with the house's noble crest. No, it was more likely your neighbour's sleeve, or more optimistically, your own. You see, wiping one's fingers on clothing was common practice at the communal feasting tables of the Middle Ages, and sleeves bore the brunt of human appetite in an age when soap was a suggestion rather than a standard. Before you despair at the lack of hygienic formality, you'll be delighted to know that napkins did exist, in a sort of early, clumsy draft form. Nobles and the wealthier classes occasionally used what were known as nappies, long cloths draped across the table or even tied around the neck like edible armor. But the common folk, they had hands, sleeves, occasionally straw-strewn floors for sticky fingers to loan their treasures to. An entire meal could be deconstructed at the knees of these proto-napkins. Grease, chicken sinew, a suspicious smear of pottage, perhaps a wayward turnip root. But far from being seen as rude, this kind of edible exuberance was expected. Eating with your hands was the thing to do. In fact, a little too much dainty behavior might have made you look French, and in certain medieval English circles, that simply would not do. Manners evolved slowly, like a sleepy tortoise sensing danger one toe at a time. And during feasts, behavior didn't just drift toward etiquette, it pirouetted around it like a drunken minstrel. Culinary codes of conduct, sometimes written as courtesy books, instructed young nobles how not to eat like woodland creatures. One 14th century guide, delightfully named The Baby's Book, instructed young diners not to pick their teeth with their knives, nor to chew with their mouths open like a boar. It also helpfully recommended that one should not blow their nose into the tablecloth. This was apparently advice worth committing to parchment. By the 15th century, behaviors had begun to shift. People experimented with personal knives, and the idea of forks, which had previously been dismissed as decadent and frankly suspicious. The church initially viewed fork usage as a dangerous deviation from God's intended genius. Fingers. Forks, in their two-pronged form, were associated with the devil's pitchfork. Only theological bravery or sheer frustration at hot stew could eventually change public opinion. But as manners tiptoed forward, so did the concept of an actual napkin used on purpose. A smaller cloth started to appear beside trenchers, the thick slabs of bread used as plates. These cloths were laid out for diners to wipe hands daintily before digging back in. Though let's be honest, dainty remains relative when you've just inhaled a half-roasted goose. In monastic communities, napkins had functional fashion flair. Some monks tied cloth to their belts to use after meals, keeping their habits safe from oily repentance. Others placed the cloth on their shoulder in an act of culinary readiness that was both admirable and reminiscent of a medieval baseball coach preparing for emotional snack time. For the aristocracy, the size of one's napkin even began to suggest status. Larger napkins meant more decadent meals. More decadent meals meant more dripping. And more dripping, of course, meant the earned right to dab at one's face with an unnecessarily large square of linen, as though jousting with one's own gluttony. Meanwhile, the peasantry still largely ignored such trimmings. When sustainability is survival, you don't fuss with thread counts or the angle of your fold. You have a crust of bread, you eat it, and any leftover gravy is likely shared with the dog or the next course. And so, in a wonderfully slow procession that took centuries, the idea of the napkin crept into common use. Not as an immediate innovation, but as a whispered suggestion passed down through palaces, churches, and eventually tavern halls. By the modern era, napkins would have their own etiquette: where to place them during the meal, how not to turn them into decorative party hats, and when it's no longer socially acceptable to use your sleeve. But for now, food was still a matter of fingers and freewheeling etiquette, a glorious mess of meat and mirth. The table, still long and crowded, buzzed not with cutlery, but companionship, and the quiet swish of sleeves working overtime. Somewhere, a nobleman dabs politely with linen. Somewhere else, a stable boy wipes goose fat on his elbow and smiles. And somewhere between those two elbows, the modern napkin dreams of becoming necessary. Let's rest now and drift toward a moment when even what you drank from mattered. And it wasn't always a cup, despite what modern catalogues may tell you. Medieval cutlery didn't exactly scream ergonomic Scandinavian design. In fact, if you wandered unsuspectingly into a 13th century banquet, you might be forgiven for assuming that table manners evolved during a power outage. And yet, even amid clashing goblets and the eternal mystery of what precisely fell into your pottage, something remarkable was happening. A slow, delightfully messy shift in how people choreographed their bites, their beliefs, and their borrowed forks. Let's consult the evidence that was never meant to survive a dishwasher. You see, for centuries, more than a baker's dozen, and definitely longer than anyone needed, the dominant eating implement was not a fork. It was your hand, or more accurately, someone else's hand, if you were important enough. Noble diners could have food lovingly hoisted into their mouths by a servant wielding a cloth napkin and a well-balanced sense of hierarchy. But among the less regal, two tools reigned supreme: the humble spoon, and the serious knife. The medieval knife was not that butter curler you find sliding aimlessly in your cutlery drawer. Oh no, these blades were personal, pointy, and potent, designed not only to slice but to imply quite unambiguously that the user had recently fought in a skirmish over questionable land boundaries. Most notably, guests were expected to bring their own knives to dinner. This created a spectrum at the table: the status symbol knife with a carved hilt made from exotic horn, all the way down to a practical blade nicked from a previous inn. In either case, you kept it close, very close, because if you didn't arrive with a utensil, people would assume you'd also be leaving with part of the roast concealed under your surcoat. In the midst of all this culinary steel, forks were the social wallflowers. Though they had existed in parts of the Byzantine Empire since at least the 11th century, most Western Europeans considered them peculiar, vaguely dangerous contraptions, like the medieval equivalent of a salad strainer with opinions. It didn't help that when the Byzantine princess Theodora Dukaina brought forks with her to the Venetian court in the 11th century, the locals were scandalized. Remember, this was an era when people bathed sometime between comet sightings, so when a noblewoman pranced into the dining hall with tiny metal tridents, daintily spearing morsels instead of jabbing them with a knife or fingers, well, that was simply too much refinement for a Tuesday. Religious leaders even chimed in. Some declared forks prideful and unnatural, a violation of divine design that had dared to improve upon hands, which God himself had clearly spent time engineering. Forks were vanity. Forks were luxury. Forks were, allegedly, contracts with the devil forged in polished silver. Naturally, this made forks wildly appealing to the upper class within 2 centuries. By the late medieval period, especially in Italian courts where pasta demanded some form of twirling implement, forks began to claw their way onto elite tables. They were still a curiosity in most households, but for those in the know, or those looking to make an impression on a cardinal, the fork had edged its way into fashion. Meanwhile, spoons enjoyed all the quiet prestige of a trusted friend. Made of wood, bone, or metal, the spoon remained a reliable workhorse for broth-like stews and anything thick enough to resist the knife's edge. The word spoon itself comes from the Old English spon, meaning chip of wood, which sounds less like cutlery and more like something you'd find clinging to your boot post carving session. Yet, in a world of the questionable textures and even more questionable meat origins, a sturdy spoon was the height of sensibility. And then there was the trencher, that whittled slab of stale bread turned edible plate, soaking up juices, cradling ladles of stew, and, in its most charitable phase, going on to serve the poor after dinner. If ever a dining item deserved a biography, the trencher would be it. Part bread, part plate, occasionally thrown at jesters, and always dignified in its soggy selflessness. So the next time you daintily pick at a salad with a fork, or sip a bisque from a curved spoon, know that centuries of cultural confusion, ecclesiastical outrage, and pasta-eating innovation laid the groundwork for your table setting. Think of your flatware drawer as a tiny museum of adaptations, each hiding the shadow of knights, monks, and saucy Venetian nobility behind their stainless steel glint. Ahead, we'll meander gently into the deliciously strange ritual of toasting, where raised goblets met superstition, suspicion, and sometimes a splash of poisoned wine. Imagine, dear dreamer, the clinking of pewter spoons and the soft thud of bare feet against rush-strewn floors. You're in a medieval hall once more, where the hearth crackles with sleepy firelight, and everyone is mildly hungry or mildly drunk, depending on the hour and what the cook managed to pull off that day. But tonight, we draw our candlelight attention not to the food, but to what was missing from the medieval table. Specifically, something you probably use daily in modern times without thinking twice. A delightful little invention known as the fork. Yes, the humble fork. That reliable, multi-tined assistant perched loyally beside your plate, ready to stab a carrot or twirl a rogue strand of linguine. But in the Middle Ages, the fork was something of an outsider. Suspicious, even scandalous. While knives were welcomed at the feast, as long as you brought your own, and spoons got by on their pudding-moving merits, forks were eyed like an unfamiliar cat at a banquet. Exotic, foreign, and probably up to something. Before forks became fashionable enough to pose in cutlery drawers across continents, finger food truly reigned supreme. After all, most platters were shared, and threading meat with your dagger or scooping things up with bread was standard. You brought your own knife. You shared your trencher, a crusty slab of stale bread used as a makeshift plate, and if gravy ran off the edge, you simply let it. But what about piping hot stew, you ask? Ah, that was spoon territory. Though medieval spoons came in fewer shapes and zero ergonomic handles, they were, at least, widely accepted. You didn't stir the social pot by using a spoon. You just stirred the actual pot. Now, about those forks. Or rather, let's say, fork singular. The earliest forks, when they appeared in Europe, caused eyebrows to lift higher than the Queen's hat at a royal garden party. In the 11th century, a Byzantine princess married into the Venetian nobility and dared, audaciously, to bring miniature golden forks with her. Outrage, utensil arrogance. Venetian clergymen promptly declared them unholy. After all, God gave humans fingers, so why sidestep divine design with these pitchforks of daintiness? And yes, they really were compared to tiny pitchforks, which made monks everywhere clutch their habits in horror. Using a fork was considered not only a feat, but dangerously sinful. It implied, ever so rudely, that God's own cutlery, your hands, was inadequate. And so, for several centuries, the fork remained the wallflower of European dining culture, slowly trickling in from the east and south, lingering awkwardly at the fringe of acceptable society. It would be some time before it was granted full papal approval and invited to live beside a knife and spoon. Even longer before it helped spear green beans in a cozy suburban kitchen. But, of course, medieval people weren't without etiquette. Quite the opposite. Rules about how to eat were enough to fill amongst scrolls, and they often did. Courtesy books, created for the children of nobility, offered very specific guidance. Do not scratch yourself with your forked bread knife. Do not put chewed bones back on the platter. Do not lick your fingers, even if juice from the roasted chicken dribbles like holy nectar. It wasn't that medieval folks were uncivilized. They simply had their own system of hygiene and decorum. One frequently washed hands before and after meals, more often than you'd expect, and certainly more than we remember them for. But perhaps the real secret is this. People then were deeply aware they were being watched. By lords, by saints, by the ancestors depicted sternly in stained glass. Everything at the table had an invisible audience. As the centuries simmered on, the fork slowly came into favor, largely thanks to influence from Italy and France. The more fashionable the courts, the more utensils appeared. By the 17th century, English nobility began accepting forks, not without grumbling, and by the 18th, the fork had become more or less domesticated. So the next time you twirl your pasta with satisfying grace or spear a raspberry with the confidence of a dessert snob, you hold a bit of radical dining history in your hand. That simple fork was once a symbol of effrontery, a scandal in stainless steel, or more precisely, golden Byzantine bling. We've come a long way from dagger-stabbing boiled mutton, but not so far that we don't occasionally eat something straight off the cutting board, standing over the sink, like a nobleman peering from a castle parapet at a realm of leftover pizza. Now, as the smells of roasted duck and medieval herbs drift into memory, let's take a moment to smooth our linen, push in our chairs, and follow the quiet trail toward a particular dinner innovation that didn't involve cutlery at all, but rather what you wore to dinner, and why it might once have stopped you from being stabbed. As twilight stretched across the stone walls of a medieval manor, you, dear listener, might picture velvet shadows gathering silently beneath a vaulted ceiling. A fire flickers in the hearth, tired flames leaning one way, then the other, as if deciding whether to nap or burn just a little longer. Candles sputter gently in iron sconces. The day's labours have quieted, and inside the hall, wooden trenchers await. Not plates exactly, not yet, but close. You see, in this curious middle ground between feast and famine, power and pottage, the notion of a communal eating vessel danced delicately on the edge of evolution. And here we are, eavesdropping gently on that domestic drama, the incredible, edible journey of table bread. Ah, the trencher, a thick, square-cut slice of stale bread, often days old and as firm as a knight's sense of duty, that served as the original dinner plate. It was bread, yes, but not for eating, at least not at first. Its purpose was noble and messy, to catch the juices of meats, the dribbles of stewed apples, the accidental elbow spill of gravy. Table manners were still developing after all. The wealthy dined upon their trenchers and when finished, offered them, soaked and flavoured like unwritten recipes, to the poor, who waited patiently beyond the manor doors. Far from a gesture of pure philanthropy, it was also the medieval version of composting, a form of edible leftovers redistribution that most modern food-sharing apps couldn't quite replicate. Some lords, being especially extravagant, used trenchers made not of stale bread, but of wood, reusable and probably much less delicious. Others carved them of hardened dough, occasionally glazed to be wipeable. Now and again, these were known to be flavoured with a hint of salt or herbs, not necessarily on purpose. Dinner was rarely private. Tables were long planks placed on trestles, collapsible, perks for a mobile gentry. Privacy was a luxury, and elbows were frequent invaders of personal space. Diners sat side by side, feasting from shared bowls and trenchers, not unlike today's fondue parties, but with more dripping meat and fewer amusing forks. One should also mention the humble spoon, not often individualized, and the occasional personal knife, not yet a full cutlery set, but rather a status symbol concealed up one sleeve. Forks, that elegant gang of tines, were viewed with deep suspicion well into the 16th century. They were, in the words of at least one ecclesiastical authority, an affront to God's design. After all, what were fingers for, if not fiddling with roast goose? In some circles, refusing to eat with one's hands was considered effete, bordering on heretical. There's a charmingly strange balance at play here. The opulence of meats stuffed with smaller meats beside trenchers soaking up the wealth, while the actual act of eating remained, primal and a bit chaotic. Decorum hovered like a sleepy bee, present but not fully settled. Then there was pottage, a dependable stew of root vegetables, grains, and whatever small protein one could coax from the land or trap in a woodland. Pottage was ladled lovingly into trenchers, steaming away with flavors that, according to monastic menus, could vary only slightly across Thursdays. What makes all this fairly enchanting is how much we don't deviate from the whole idea. Modern bread bowls filled with clam chowder or chili. That's a trencher dressed up for a night out. The idea of letting food mingle with its container, then devouring both, is an ancient dream we just keep having, possibly in carb form. And the leftovers. These were not taken home in Benito-branded boxes, but often gathered for the serving staff or those humble enough to ask for alms at the postern gate. Food waste, though not altogether absent, was less of a medieval sin and more of a missed opportunity. So here we rest, drowsy and full, at the edge of the high table, the trencher before us now just damp history. But whispers of it still drift through buffets and soup stations, calling to the civilized caveman in us all. There is more, of course. The ceremonial protocols and edible pageantry of noble feasting, just beginning to stretch toward its golden edges. But that, dear listener, is a morsel for another moonlit moment. If you were seated at a medieval banquet, perhaps somewhere in a stone hall hung with tapestries and the occasional roasted boar's head for decoration, because nothing says festive like pork-based taxidermy, you might notice something peculiar atop the long wooden table. No, not the singing minstrel perched suspiciously close to the bread trencher. I mean what's not there. Plates. Ordinary, round, ceramic plates, the kind you probably clinked your spoon against at breakfast. Nowhere to be seen. Instead, in front of each medieval diner would sit something far more pious and stale, a slab of yesterday's bread. These were the trenchers, literally thick slices of dry, flat bread, often about 6 inches across, and about as structurally sound as a roof tile in January. These bready discs served as edible tableware, upon which everything from roasted quail to suspiciously brown stews were ladled. Now, in theory, you ate your meal off the trencher. In practice? Well, it depended on how soaked your bread had become from goat drippings and berry compote. Some trenchers were eaten once the meal was over. Others were mercifully donated to the poor or the local dogs. Often the same thing in feudal neighborhoods. It's a brilliant idea, really. An eco-conscious dining experience centuries before paper straws. Though, one must imagine the moment when your spoon breaks through the gravy barrier and plunges into the bread, sending a cascade of venison bits onto your lap. Particularly tragic if you were wearing your third best tunic. But wait, just because you didn't have a plate didn't mean you didn't observe table manners. In fact, medieval etiquette was as elaborate as a peacock curry. For instance, it was considered ill-bred to blow your nose on the tablecloth, a guideline we can all still get behind. But it gets better. You were advised by the etiquette books of the Middle Ages to wipe your mouth before drinking from a shared cup. This wasn't just politeness. Everyone at the table might be sipping from the same goblet of wine or ale as it made its slow circuit from person to person, like a soggy carousel of germs and goodwill. One careless lip print could turn brotherly bonds into literal influenza. And let's not forget salt. In the middle of the medieval table sat a salt cellar, a symbol of status as much as stomach. If you were seated above the salt, it meant you were important. Clergy, knights, landowners. Sit below the salt and, well, you were not. You were humble, or at least humbler than the salt's prestigious latitude. Curiously, This medieval salt segregation echoes something many of us still do. Those of us who still fight relatives for the good spot at a holiday table. Front of the room, near the fireplace, kingly. Perched next to the kitchen door, under a flickering sconce, serfdom. Dining in the Middle Ages wasn't just about survival, it was theatre. There were processions of dishes, each arriving with fanfare, sometimes literally. Trumpeters might announce the arrival of roasted swan or gilded hare, their feathers lovingly reapplied with pins after cooking, lest the aesthetic be compromised. Presentation mattered, sometimes more than the flavour, a fact not lost on modern food influencers whose devotion to edible symmetry would fit right in among court chefs of the 14th century. Interestingly, many of the dishes served at these grand meals were less seasoned for taste and more seasoned for preservation. Spices were expensive, yes, but also practical. In an age before refrigeration, a little clove or nutmeg went a long way in distracting your dinner guests from the mild hint of slightly expired game. And speaking of distraction, entertainment was often woven right into the meal, or rather, just after it. Jesters tumbling near the fig custards, trained dogs performing cute pirouettes before licking the trenchers clean, and troubadours reciting heroic ballads with only moderate spilling of pear sauce. All part of the experience. Even the tableware, such as it was, sometimes became the entertainment, particularly in the case of edible centerpieces, say, a pie crust that, when opened, released not steam, but a confused chorus of live birds. The phrase 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie was less nonsense and more half-hearted medieval aeronautics. As the coals in the hearth begin to whisper into ash, and our imaginary goblets are drained of their honeyed wine, we'll leave the banquet table for just a moment. There is still so much to explore in the cupboards and kitchens of history. Places where what we eat, and more delightfully, how we eat it, binds us ever closer to the sleepy-eyed revelers of the distant past. In the gentle flicker of torchlight, when banquets wound down to murmured chatter and loosened belts, a curious communal ritual took place across medieval Europe. One not of feasting, but of face-wiping. Yes, friends, tonight we pirouette softly into the fabric-laden world of medieval napkins, the unsung heroes of hands, lips, and dignity. And no, not the dainty squares folded like swans on your modern holiday table. These were grand, sometimes communal, and often entirely theoretical. First, we must define the battlefield. Imagine a long trestle table, sagging politely under trenchers, pies, and oddly optimistic jellies. Guests sat shoulder to shoulder, sleeves at the ready, some with the privilege of a cloth, others with naught but the wind and their own wrists. You see, napkins in the medieval period weren't the ubiquitous post-morsel mopping tools we know today. They were elite instruments, often reserved for the upper crust, the very upper crust. Basically, the crust that could afford both bread and someone else to butter it. In the early medieval world, before forks staged their slow invasion, the napkin had not yet found solid employment. Everything worth eating could be grabbed. Everything not worth grabbing was probably soup. Napkins in this age popped up mostly in monasteries and royal courts, where order and silence were taken very seriously. Monks would eat in earnest rows, cloaks draped politely away from spills, while napkins, a kind of cloth called a lintim, rested across the table. These were sometimes communal, which sounds charming until you remember. One cloth, 30 monks, and a lentil stew. The monastic napkin, while practical, was not especially individual. But then came more refined, feasting. By the 14th century, an age of Gothic arches, pointed hats, and a sudden preoccupation with cleanliness. Personal napkins began to appear among nobler diners. So did intricate manners books, full of helpful commands like "wipe thy knife before thou lickest it," and "do not use thy neighbour's robe to dry thy beard." Sage advice, frankly. Napkins in fashion became long, rectangular, and often tied about the neck or draped across the shoulder, like a very clean little cape. Sometimes guests tied them to their belts, like textile flags of courtesy. You'd think having a cloth handy might reduce sleeve smearing, but no. Medieval sleeves were notoriously roomy, and often volunteered themselves bravely into gravies and sauces. Hosts with wealth and an eye for cleanliness, or at least the optics of it, might provide guests with water basins for rinsing and soft cloths for drying. These washes often involved perfumed water, and the napkins themselves could be embroidered with a family crest or whimsical flora. Because nothing says, "I care about hygiene," like dabbing your chin with a linen rectangle featuring your host's heraldic squirrel. However, for many common folk, napkins were still a luxury. A peasant meal often meant bread, broth, and busy fingers. When things got messier, one might wipe hands on the tablecloth itself, if one were present, or on the bench, or, we regret to report, on one's dog. Dogs, it seems, were a flexible part of the medieval dining ensemble. Foot warmers, scrap collectors, and on brisk days, sudsy companions. But here's where history gets adorably persistent. The idea that a cloth near your plate might preserve your dignity lives on today in our careful folding of fabric beside silverware. A tradition born from monks, modified by monarchs, and eventually trickled down to fancy brunch spots with oat milk lattes. And before we leave, we must raise a soft linen salute to the French serviette, the Italian tovagliolo, and the sturdy English servitor in all its forms. However humble, however embroidered with accidental mustard hieroglyphs, the napkin remains a surviving soldier of medieval mealtime civility. So next time you uncurl that napkin on your lap, think of the medieval diner, elbow deep in pottage, reaching for a cloth, and perhaps just once considering the dog. Napkin or not, the quest for cleanliness has long been a tangled tale told at dinner time. But the cloth-covered table of history has a few more crumbs to offer. As the candles wane and your eyelids begin to droop like a poorly starched ruff, our journey into the rituals of etiquette drifts onward to a curious chapter involving spoons, saints, and some unexpectedly sharp social commentary. Somewhere near the murmuring hearths of medieval manors and the wind-whispered rafters of low-ceilinged cottages, a quiet yet revolutionary shift was unfolding, not among kings or crusaders, but upon the humble dining table, or more accurately, upon the concept of cutlery. Imagine, if you will, a long oak board set with trenchers, perhaps softened bread or slabs of stale rye repurposed as edible plates. Olives may be missing, but there's plenty of pottage. Across the table, a leathery knight is eyeing a pigeon pie, his eyes glinting with hunger and perhaps just a trace of 12th century malice. And in his hand, gripped like a scepter of personal sovereignty, is not a fork, but a dagger. Yes, a dagger. In medieval dining, the knife reigned supreme, and not the table-friendly butter knife type, more like the sharp, versatile, sometimes blood-stained variety one might use to both carve a roast and duel a rival. Every noble guest brought their own knife, which really added a certain tension to dinner parties. Meals were participatory spectacles, and everyone expected you to stab your food like a minor battle before lifting it to your lips. Want a bit of roast? Jab it? A wedge of cheese? slice, with flair. If you looked anxious during mealtime, it wasn't indigestion. It was probably the fellow next to you testing his blade's edge on the mutton. Remarkably, nobody had a dedicated dining fork. That peculiar creature was still centuries from widespread acceptance. In fact, in some circles, forks were viewed with suspicion, as foreign, frivolous, and vaguely blasphemous. God gave us fingers, the logic went, and knives. That ought to be enough. Using a fork implied, perhaps, that the divine design had fallen short somewhere between thumb and forefinger. But, whisper it gently, some early adopters just couldn't resist. The Byzantine Empire dabbled with forks earlier than the rest of Europe, and when a Byzantine princess named Theophanu married into the Holy Roman Empire in the 10th century, she brought her tiny two-pronged utensils along. They were so dainty, so elegant, so deeply confusing to everyone else. Some onlookers were scandalized. Others thought the forks looked like pitchforks, demonic in miniature. It didn't help that Theophanu's life story didn't end well. After her death, some monks saw fit to label her fork use as tragically hubristic, as if wielding refined cutlery brought about divine judgment. May your salad never be speared, they didn't quite say, lest heaven frown. Still, the idea lingered quietly, like a culinary ghost. Forks began to sneak into Italian courts by the late Renaissance, especially among those fearful of touching their food directly. There were whispers of sanitation, sophistication, and a desire to avoid greasy fingers on embroidered cuffs. Ah, vanity, the true mother of etiquette. But back in our medieval halls, fingers were still the most favoured tools. Index and thumb teamed up to extract morsels. Communal bowls meant everyone dipped from the same stew, and hand hygiene was more a hope than a habit. A basin of water might be passed prior to feasting, with the host dipping first to demonstrate decency. However, scrub-a-dub-dubbing wasn't exactly rigorous, and soap was a rare guest. Interestingly, the custom of not scratching improperly during dinner, recorded in numerous household manuals, suggests that guests were generally very much within reach of one another. Packed shoulder to shoulder, eating with pointed knives and unwashed hands, it was less MasterChef and more polite melee. By the end of the Middle Ages, the knife finally lost its dangerous edge, both literally and figuratively. Table knives became rounder, blunter, partly because of an etiquette revolution, partly, perhaps, thanks to rising insurance premiums among dinner hosts. When Cardinal Richelieu, yes, the plotting, robe-wearing French power broker, famously had his kitchen staff dull the pointy knives to discourage toothpicking, and more importantly, violence at the tableware tide began to turn. It wouldn't be until the 17th and 18th centuries that the fork carved out its rightful spot beside the knife, and the spoon, loyal, slurp-friendly, always reliable, rounded out the trio. But seeds of this transformation were nestled in the noisy, meat-scented halls of medieval dining. So next time you lift your salad fork, or catch a glimpse of your butter knife lying harmlessly beside a linen napkin, spare a moment for the era when such items were scandalous, unholy, or weapons. And with that, let the echoes of medieval clatter fade for now, as we softly follow the scent of spices drifting through the air toward a hidden ingredient that once ruled the medieval kitchen like a fragrant monarch. And now we drift into the dining halls of the late Middle Ages, a realm where eating was more than necessity. Oh yes, it was performance, ritual, and, quite often, a peculiar test of balance. Picture it: long trestle tables in smoky great halls, flickering torchlight playing across stone walls, and the rustle of pages from psalters wafting between courses of slightly overboiled cabbage. The medieval dinner party was not your average potluck, unless your potluck also included a pig's head wearing a citrus fruit crown. By the 14th century, courtly dining had become a true spectacle, complete with minstrels, hand-washing rituals, and food so elaborately disguised, you often needed a degree in poultry to determine if that was a real swan or simply a chicken in fancy dress. Gilded pastry crusts were constructed like miniature fortresses, and beneath them lay goose, lark, or the occasional hedgehog, if you were feeling brave. A good cook could turn an eel into a pastry-based unicorn. A great one could do it while muttering prayers in Latin. But there was one medieval invention we've quietly inherited, a staple of your kitchen drawer even now. Not the fork. Oh no, that's still hiding in the wings of history at this point, nervously waiting for its big break. We're speaking of the humble napkin. Now, if you just gasped in polite 21st century horror at the thought of napkinless society, I must gently remind you, our medieval friends didn't lack concern for cleanliness per se. They had cloths, they had sleeves, they had, less glamorously, the tablecloth itself. Yes, wiping your hands on the tablecloth wasn't poor manners, it was protocol. At grand meals, long strips of cloth called mains were laid down the length of the table, used for wiping fingers or dabbing at beards that had caught one too many morsels of minced lamprey. Personal napkins, though, now that was innovation. And in the private chambers of the 14th and 15th centuries, cloth squares began to appear folded beside trenchers, establishing the early silhouette of the dining etiquette we now entirely ignore during pizza night. Speaking of trenchers, those edible plates, often a stale chunk of bread used as both serving dish and sponge for the enthusiastic gravy, had begun to evolve. Over time, instead of being eaten or tossed to dogs, or possibly suspicious-looking orphans lurking near the door, trenchers started to be made of pewter and later wood. The idea of a permanent reusable plate, progress in the form of not eating where your elbow rested. But manners were still very much experimental. Remember, chewing with your mouth closed wasn't even encouraged in some circles. Making joyful noise while dining was a sign of pleasure. In fact, if you chewed silently and frowned, your host might send a physician, thinking your humors were out of balance. Burping, acceptable. Licking your knife, optional, though best avoided at banquets with royalty, especially if the king's physician was seated next to you and had a weak stomach. Cutlery itself was still an evolving concept. Most people had their own knife, worn on the belt, and used it for everything from dissecting game fowl to pointing at the offending turnip in conversation. The spoon was allowed at the party, but remained humble and mostly devoted to soft foods, pottage, or stirring whatever was simmering over the hearth. The fork, still considered suspicious, a sort of two-pronged pick associated with Venice, foreignness, and perhaps Satan, would not enjoy British acceptance for quite some time. It was finger food, or nothing. Meanwhile, wine. It was flowing, but not as ritzy as you might assume, often cut with water to make it last, or alternatively, flavored with herbs and honey in an attempt to distract from the fact that it faintly resembled horse liniment in taste. Ale, light and milky, was the drink of the common table. Nobody expected your drink to sparkle unless it had accidentally fermented too far. And above it all, the etiquette manuals, those glorious medieval how-to guides that instructed young nobles not to blow their nose with the tablecloth. Again, use your sleeve. not to gnaw bones, then pass them to your neighbour, he has his own pig, and certainly not to share a goblet by dunking your fingers into it first. These treasured works shaped behaviours that, to this day, keep us from licking butter knives in public. But as the candlelight fades and the last course, a perfumed apple or candied rose petal, is enjoyed in near sacred silence, we'll pull our embroidered sleeves over our hands, pat our mouths politely, and wander further into the world of dining's delightfully strange past, where our next topic still lingers patiently, like a roasted pheasant cooling on a medieval sideboard. Imagine, if you will, the dimly lit corner of a medieval kitchen, wooden beams overhead, a hearth murmuring in the background, and a haze of herb-scented steam rising like forgotten thoughts from a bubbling pot. We come now to a humble, curious object that shaped centuries of dining, and yet today would barely earn a second glance. The trencher. Not a knight, not a battle, not even a mysterious relic sealed in a cathedral basement. No, just a plate, or what they had before. Plates were, well, proper plates. You see, the medieval trencher was essentially a stale slice of bread, thick like a hobbit's boot sole and about as edible after a few hours. It was the original edible dishware, long before celebrity chefs began dabbling in avant-garde bread bowls and soup-filled pumpkins. These bread platters sat loyally beneath stews, meats and sauces, doing the double job of catching the juices and feeding the dog later. Yes, dogs. If a noble or wealthy diner didn't feel like finishing their gravy-saturated trencher, which, to be fair, likely resembled a sponge that had lived too long beneath the sink, it was customary to give it away, to servants, or to the church, or to the poor, or yes, occasionally to the family hound, waiting under the table with eyes full of hope and questionable digestion. But here's the strange beauty. The trencher was both utensil and offering, a subtle, soggy symbol of charity. Of course, no one writes epic ballads about reused bread plates, but perhaps it's time someone did. In wealthier homes, trenchers evolved over time into wooden or metal serving platforms, still called trenchers oddly enough, and moved off the edible spectrum entirely. These evolved versions became beloved mainstays at long trestle tables, which, like much of medieval furniture, had the aesthetic charm of something quickly assembled before a thunderstorm. Dining in such households was a choreographed routine that would rival any Broadway show. The procession of dishes, the elaborate hierarchy of seating, and the mysterious art of sops, chunks of bread dipped into wine or broth, which were then elegantly slurped, precisely one drip short of disgrace. And while we're on etiquette, do you know where breaking bread with someone came from? It wasn't just poetic Christian symbolism. In a world before cutlery education, sharing bread quite literally was a sign that you were setting down weapons and joining others at the table. Once everyone had a warm, somewhat rigid hunk of bread in hand, it was clear, we're not fighting, we're dining. Possibly messily. Now, take this small detail with you. Medieval diners rarely had individual plates. A pair of guests would often share one trencher between them. Platonic intimacy, bonded by lamb stew and mutual crumbs. The trenchers, especially the bread ones, also served another hidden purpose. They were quiet. In great echoing halls of stone and wood, with servants shuffling and minstrels meandering out slightly over-ambitious versions of greensleeves, having a soft little platform to muffle the thunk of roasted goose hitting the table was, frankly, an acoustic mercy. And while forks were still centuries from becoming standard at medieval tables, feared by many as tiny, sinister tridents of the devil, hands were the tools of choice. Wash beforehand? Sometimes. Let's leave it romantically vague, but with everyone tearing meat and sopping sauces in their shared bread platters, it's no wonder that tablecloths were often used as communal hand towels. Yes, you heard correctly. That pristine snow-white runner laid across the dining table. You'd wipe your gravy-streaked fingers right on it, and that was considered polite. It wasn't all chaos, though. There was a method to the medieval mealtime, from carefully timed toasts to intricate rituals around carving meats. Oh yes, carving was a noble affair, often performed by a man with the official title of carver, who had studied under the best. It was an honor. It was a science. It was tragically prone to surprise splatters. So the next time you find yourself grumbling about setting out matching china or debating the ethics of reusable napkins, remember the trencher. Remember the bread that held 1,000 stews before being flung to the monastery or the mongrel. The next time your dinner plate seems too symmetrical, whisper a quiet thank you for a time when tableware might very well go stale before dessert. And as twilight settles over our candlelit dining tale, we move from the trencher to another overlooked wonder of the medieval table. Not what they ate on, but what they drank from. Where goblets gleamed and suspicion of water ran deep. But that's a story for another sip. As twilight creeps along the edges of the banquet hall, casting long shadows across the stone floors and flickering candlelight over worn oak tables, our tale turns to an often overlooked medieval mystery. The curious case of knives. Yes, knives. Those silent, gleaming companions at our modern tables have a long and occasionally violent biography. In the early Middle Ages, the idea of a table set with uniform cutlery would have seemed downright extravagant, or perhaps worse, suspiciously French. For quite some time, people were expected to bring their own knives to dinner, like some kind of socially acceptable culinary weapon. In fact, the personal knife was so common that forgetting it was tantamount to forgetting your shoes. No small faux pas if you expected to eat things that weren't already mashed, broiled, or butter soft. And so, guests arrived, blade in belt, ready to carve, scoop, and occasionally brandish. Knives weren't just for slicing your meat, they were for asserting your presence. Sharp blades were sharpened personalities. One might even say that the dinner conversation sparkled less brightly than the dagger beside the roast. It wasn't until the 17th century, long after the high medieval pageantry had faded, that knives began to soften their image, literally. The tips were rounded, dulled, reshaped by royal decree to create a more civilized mood at court. When Cardinal Richelieu, yes, that very same scheming statesman of France, noticed a dinner guest using his knife to rather distastefully pick his teeth, he supposedly became so horrified that he ordered all knives rounded at the tip, and just like that, dental hygiene hastened cutlery reform. This soothing notion that a man could no longer pick his molars after braised goose spread across Europe and landed eventually on our modern tables, where knives now lie politely, rarely confronting one's neighbor. Spoons had their own humble beginnings. In the medieval world, they were largely reserved for soups, porridges, and the occasional stew that had loosened its structure a tad too enthusiastically. Wooden spoons were common, shared, and often dangerously splintery. Silver spoons, unsurprisingly, were for the upper crust, quite literally. Possessing a personal spoon, especially one tucked into a leather sheath on your belt, became something of a modest status symbol. A person's spoon might have been passed down through generations, absorbing, no doubt, some of the stories and perhaps some of the stews of one's ancestors. There was a reason to be born with a silver spoon, and only a tiny percent of people were fortunate enough to experience such metallurgic privilege. Now, forks. Yes. Forks took their sweet medieval time making it to the party. The earliest forks were not table flatware but culinary tools, two prongs wickedly dramatic, better suited for grilling boar over open flame than delicately swirling noodles, which, incidentally, no one in medieval England had. When the fork finally did arrive at European dining tables, likely via Byzantine or Arab influence, it caused significant scandal. To some, it seemed like culinary sorcery, an unnatural device that separated man from his God-given hands. One 11th century Venetian princess married into the Byzantine court and brought forks with her, which shocked her new in-laws. When she died young, whispers flew, divine punishment for her impious forkery. Better to eat with clean fingers and a guilty conscience than demonic prongs, apparently. Nevertheless, the fork eventually found its groove. Italians, noodle innovators, of note, embraced it first, then the French, delicately, one assumes, and then the English, who were reluctantly dragged into culinary modernity around the time wigs and waistcoats became fashionable. By the 1700s, the table was mostly set, with forks, knives, and spoons each enjoying their own space and social codes. Like guests at a very polite family reunion, they had grown accustomed to each other's sharp points and rounded curves, coexisting peacefully with the occasional squabble over salad. And so, while we now dine under soft lighting, our forks gently clinking against porcelain with an air of mild civility, we are, in fact, heirs to 1,000 years of blade etiquette, gossip-driven silverware evolution, and the collective decision, somewhere along the way, to stop stabbing our peas. Now, as candlelight flickers low and the chairs grow quieter still, we leave behind these humble tools of chop and chew. Ahead, the banquet winds down, and the final course approaches. No less strange, no less familiar. Through candlelight and time, we arrive quietly at the edge of our tale, where spoons clink more softly, bread loses its crust to the hush of centuries, and even the onions begin to whisper. Tonight, let us end where all good meals and most medieval feasts conclude, in a bloated mixture of gratitude, fatigue, and a surprising lack of forks. Yes, despite all the goblets, gizzards, and goose-fat gravy we've traipsed through, there remains a modest yet unwieldy truth. For much of medieval dining, the fork was considered suspiciously dainty, almost French. To be fair, its earliest appearances in Europe, delicate, two-pronged, unsuitable for most trench warfare or ox-joint carving, were met with skepticism. In 11th century Italy, Theodora Anna Ducaina, a Byzantine princess, dared to use a golden fork at dinner. The locals were not impressed. The clergy, in fact, sniffed at her excessive delicacy and muttered something about God giving us fingers for a reason. Meanwhile, across wood-planked halls in England and France, fingers were indeed flourishing. Nobles used their own daggers, ornate and probably not too clean, as makeshift steak knives. Shared bowls brimming with stews, savouries, and occasionally someone's sleeve were passed down the trestle tables, all accompanied by the rich chorale of belching and theological opinions. Yet amid this hands-on hospitality, little habits were forming. Bread, for instance, the simple loaf, which had long served as plate and sponge, evolved over time. Its name, trencher, evoked both its role in dining and its fate. Fed to the poor, dogs or the flames. But soon, better bread and glazed ceramic nudged the trencher aside. What was once edible cutlery became something less literal, more polite, fewer juices soaking your palm, more stainable linen. Ladles emerge from cauldrons like conquering heroes of soup. Napkins edged out shirt sleeves. Even the toothpick, carved delicately from silver or chewed wood, earned its place as both status and necessity. Imagine dining beside a nobleman, delicately prodding at his molar with a filigreed pick, then tucking it back into a pouch, like a tiny sword being sheathed. Some customs departed more reluctantly. Table manners, for example, had the stamina of a medieval mule. Don't blow your nose with the tablecloth. Don't lick your neighbour's spoon. Don't let your falcon claw at the roast. All written down, lest common sense go rogue. Even meals themselves had structure. The service à la française, that is, French service, plopped bowls, joints, pies and puddings onto the table all at once. Guests helped themselves, feasting like kings or squabbling like siblings. Then, in later centuries, came service à la Russe, or Russian service, where dishes were brought in courses one at a time, with a certain operatic flourish. And from there, the modern dinner party emerged, somehow both more organized and infinitely more anxious. Yet not everything is gone from the days of goblets and gizzards. The toast, believe it or not, has its roots in medieval merriment. Guests would raise a cup, and perhaps a suspicion, as they drank to health or loyalty. The practice was called pledging, and the cup often loving. Sometimes a spiced hunk of toasted bread would be tossed into the drink to soak up the bitterness, and voila, toast. Even our word companion comes from Latin roots that mean with bread. To share a table, steal a crust, or break a loaf. These acts remain central to connection. Long before instant messages or emojis, bread was the original group chat. And as we settle back beneath our cozy mental blankets, it's comforting to know that many of the small, forgettable things we do at the table, passing the salt, waiting for the host to eat first, hiding our lack of fork technique under napkins, are all just echoes of long tables by firelight, of trenchers carved by weary hands, of jesters stealing sausages and kings pretending not to notice, of apples shared beside castle hearths, and wine drunk perhaps too readily after vespers. And maybe, just maybe, millennia later, as we reach across the table for a ladle or stab at a stubborn root vegetable, we aren't that different from the cloaked diners of long ago. We want warmth, we want flavor, we want the comfort of company and the joy of chewing something that doesn't fight back. So tonight, as the last course is cleared and the candles flicker low, let's not worry about tomorrow's dishes or the feasts still waiting in the cabinets of history. Tonight, we've eaten well, perhaps in body, perhaps in spirit, and that, dear dreamer, is more than enough. Sleep well. The past is full, and your pillow awaits.